Okay, so here's our compound static mesh actor class we were talking about. To add this, I just did a right click here on classes, added a new item, created the name compound static mesh actor, and then hit OK. And by default, it was deriving from object, and so I updated that. Also made it, added this keyword, class keyword placeable, and this is what will make it an object, class that will show up in the actor class browser in bold. You'll notice there's some that are bold and some that are not. The idea or the convention there is that the bold ones have that placeable keyword and are objects that you can place in the editor and save into a level file, whereas the other ones are not there, just there as a base class essentially. So a couple of things I added to this simple class just to show you an example of what you can do by extending something that already exists in UnrealScript as a totally usable object. A static mesh actor is one of the most commonly used actors or object types in the editor. I mean, every level is built out with thousands of static meshes. BSP is used, a lot as a foundation, but then everything kind of gets set dressed with the static mesh actor. So what I did here was just extend from that and then add a single variable. And you see the variable also added the parentheses here with a name, which is static mesh actor, which is already going to be an object category. We'll open up the editor here and show you kind of why I did that. But had I left this blank, it would have created a new category, which was the default name of the class, which would have been okay, but then we would have had the two static mesh components and two separate areas of the properties, which is not very intuitive or useful. So also added a constant here because we don't want this to the actual static mesh component to be editable. The static mesh component has its own internal variables, which we'll show you here in the UI for the properties, which has a mesh component variable, which is what we'll be setting. But you don't want to be able to actually edit the static mesh component object or variable itself. So that's why it's got the const and the editor const. And just gave it the variable name here. Inside the default properties, you're going to see the begin end object for the component. The static mesh actor, if you look at this class, we can right click, say go to definition. This inherits from or extends the static mesh base. And if you look down here, it's doing the same thing and creating static mesh component 0. So by extending this class, just made a static mesh component 1, and then go ahead and add that component. So that's really all this is. I mean, it's very, very simple. But now we can open up the editor and show you a static mesh, side by side with a compound static mesh and kind of what the difference is, so you see the correlation. Okay, so here back in the editor, click on the actor classes tab in the generic browser. So here, again, you've got the list of all of the different classes. You see actor up here is kind of like the topmost. That's all that's visible here. And these are all the classes that are derived from actor, and some have multiple chains of inheritance here. So what we're looking for is the static mesh. Okay, so under static mesh actor base, you've got static mesh actor, which is a placeable object, and as you can tell by the bold, and that's kind of the typical one. And then you'll also see it has some derived classes or child classes. There's a total of 4 of them, but the one we're interested in is the one that we just created, which is the compound static mesh actor. So you'll see that entry there. So just to compare what kind of the difference is, I mean, we've looked at it in the script, but I'll go ahead and drop in an instance of the regular static mesh actor. So we'll jump over to the content browser, go ahead and select this create mesh. I'm going to make sure I have static mesh selected. I do. I'm going to right click, add actor. Need to load the mesh into memory first. And so now I get this option to place the static mesh. All right, so there we go. All right, so there's our just kind of typical static mesh box. So now if we open up the content browser again, and we'll leave the static mesh selected that we have, but this time we're going to select the compound static mesh actor, and we're going to place one of those guys right here. So a few things that are going to be different here. One, when we place it, it doesn't actually come in with that mesh already assigned to it. There's additional script that would have to be added to get that sort of contextual stuff happening. Since the class is very bare bones and simple, the only difference right now is that it has that extra mesh component, which we can tell by opening up the properties. So what I'm going to do is open up the properties for our compound static mesh actor, and I'm going to lock it. And then I'm going to change my selection here to over here and open up the properties for this guy. So here we have the regular static mesh, and you'll see under the static mesh actor category section of the property panel, you've got the local variables that we saw inside of the static mesh actor class, namely the static mesh component. Now remember, the component was marked as an editor constant, which means that even though I can see and expand this, I can't delete this component, right? So if it was not a constant, that would have the option to remove that. So we want to make sure that this is constant, and then the stuff that is editable is what is contained inside of that component class, which what we're interested in is the actual static mesh component, and there's a static mesh. Now you see it already populated because when we added it, it populated that variable for us based off of the context of what was selected. There's our crate, and that's what we're looking at right here. So then we look at our compound static mesh, though, and under the same heading, because we, in the script file here, took the time to go ahead and label what category of the properties we want it to be under. Otherwise, by default, it would have chosen the class name if you don't specify anything there. So we've made sure it's showed up under the same, and you'll see the normal static mesh component that's coming from the static mesh actor class. But because we're a compound static mesh, you now see this additional component that we added, and this is secondary. So what we can do with this, we still have the crate selected in the content browser. We can come into the first static mesh component, and we can go ahead and green arrow here to use selected object, and there you go. So I'm going to go ahead and close the static mesh actor properties. So now our compound static mesh looks, exactly the same because they are the same. We're just right now we haven't changed or altered anything that wasn't already part of the static mesh class. So now if we bounce back over to the content browser and we select this mesh sphere and we close, and now we're going to add this as a secondary mesh just to show what happens. So now I add the selection. Okay. So now I have two mesh components, which are both now populated with an actual mesh reference. So you see that I have a single, selectable object. Notice that the only object with collision is the first object, and that is because if we look at the script file here, when you look at static mesh actor, notice that it is setting its collision component to essentially the collision component of the static mesh component, and then it also sets the static mesh component to that, and then adds the component. Here we are not taking the step to actually do the collision, and that's kind of intentional because there's some restrictions unless you're doing special objects that a single mesh can only have, or a single actor can only have one collision object stored on it. So it would be weird and probably cause some problems if you tried to add the collision component for the secondary one. In this case, it's those two meshes that we're using to visualize it work well for visualizing that there's two, very different meshes that are being rendered by the same actor. But this, would not be the typical use. But what you might do is have something like a weapon, or not even a weapon, but like a static piece of geometry that could have interchangeable pieces on the top. And so, in a lot of cases, people will prefab those or just make two separate versions of it. But if you wanted to say, if you were really trying to save memory and cut down on geometry, you could have the the base of some object be truly shared or instance, and then you could have different versions kind of stacked on top of it and have those not have collision based on the size, or the base could include the collision for it. Just a lot of different ways you could do it. The compound idea of a mesh is not implemented by default in Unreal for good reason, because there's other complications with it, but it kind of is a good example of how you can simply extend an existing class. And in this case, in just a few lines of script, you've got something totally new placeable object, two renderable instances in it. Yeah, so that's kind of it. And the other thing I liked about this example is that it just reinforced what you can do as far as placing your own custom properties in here. So if you had not put, just to kind of review the variables, if we had left off the parentheses completely, this static mesh component would not even show up. And since we're not setting a default anywhere, essentially it would be useless because you couldn't actually change what was being set to it. but by making it editable in the editor with the parentheses, as well as specifying which category or group of properties, which in this case is static mesh actor, you have a very readable property menu here that is kind of intuitive as far as what's here and what's stored here. And you'll see, there's the other kind of constants that are coming from these property panels or sections are coming from the actor base class. But you can, update these. So if you had a particular object that you wanted to add some special, properties to that fit under these categories, you can certainly add to them, just like we did for the static mesh actor. All right, so that's kind of an overview of classes, how you get them to show up and be placeable here in the actor class. Well, just getting them to show up just means you have to at some point derive from actor, but the placeable versus non-placeable is important to remember, and then also how to make sure that the properties are going to be edited and editable and easy to find and intuitively placed. All right.